Bum 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 bum. The Peter Dislike Show. Bum 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 bum. So this past week, I recorded a series of videos about a little concept that I like to call clock fever, or sometimes hurry mania, or time sickness, or among other uh, issues. I used to I had a coworker who called it an angry clock syndrome. The idea is that even though you might work some number of hours in the week, right? That the clock doesn't just tick during those hours. And the best way to see this is by example, right? So uh, I uh, I teach at two different community colleges, and I'm often thinking about even when I'm sitting at home eating a meal, right? I have to think about is is my clothes going to be ready? If I have to pack a meal to the campus, right? Because let's face it, I can't afford to eat at the dining halls every day. I wish I could, though, by the way, because there are definitely important networking connections I could make if I could do that. And I got to think about that. When I get off of work, I have to think about when everything is going to wind down so I can go to sleep so that I can go to work again tomorrow, right? So imagine it's 8 o'clock at night. There's a limit to what I could be doing, right? I can't be intoxicated in some way, right? I don't really use anything, but I do drink a lot of caffeine. I got to watch that by the time it's 8 p.m., right? I can't freely just drink whatever I want to, right? I can't freely just eat whatever I want to. If I eat something that might keep me up, right? I used to have binge eating problems, right? Conversely, I love intermittent fasting, but sometimes, depending on the situation on hand, right, it puts a limit to how I can do the fast, right? This was much more apparent when I was doing the tutoring work, right? Oftentimes, I would get a client that y- let's say I'm in the middle of a fast, right? I'm 14 hours, 15 hours into the fast. And in theory, I could keep going, but now I got to begin a shift that might be 5, 6, 7 hours long. And maybe I don't want to fast another 5, 6, 7 hours, but I do want to fast another 2 hours, right? And so it puts a constraint on what else could happen even outside of the that's what I wanted so you get paid for whatever these hours are, but your commitment really lasts that long, right? When you zoom out of it, right? uh at least in some way or another. It's I got to teach a class in 20 minutes, right? I can't just fire up my furnace for working with casting metals right now because it's going to stay hot for another 2 hours, right? You get the idea, right? The commitment to work spills over to other hours of your life in terms of what you can eat, in terms of what you can do, right? I can't do something that might get me all wired up right now, right? So, for example, half an hour before class, I might want to avoid anything that might lead to conflict, right? Imagine I wanted to uh I collect coins, right? This would be a really bad time for me to try to call a coin dealer and try to haggle the price on a gold coin or something like that because I'll get all wired up and it will mess up the emotions of the class of in half an hour, right? That's what I wanted to get at, right? Conversely, let's talk about a time when I didn't have clock fever or time sickness or whatever you want to call it. I was on vacation in Kerrville, Texas. I went to go see a solar eclipse in April. It's about a 15-hour drive away, and I took the drive over the course of 2, 3 days. I had stopped in, I think it was El Paso, got out of my car to go to a grocery store and just randomly talk to a few people, get some groceries. As I was doing that, something hit me like a breath of fresh air. The solar eclipse was 3, 4 days away at this point, if I remember correctly, so I wasn't in any big rush. I remember why I drove in so early that week. I have really bad luck with my cars. Uh, I always get a flat tire on Sundays when I can't find a tire repair shop. The solar eclipse was on a Monday, and I wanted to make sure I finished the drive on Saturday before the tire shops had closed because I always run into trouble with my car on Sunday for some reason. I just had a battery die on me on a Sunday as well. It was good because I wasn't living too far away from the campus, and I took it as an opportunity to explore other things that I had to walk to or just nearby, right? And but that's the kind of fortunes I have with my car. So I drove in early. It was Thursday or Friday. I had gone to the grocery store in El Paso, and for the first time, it hit me like a breath of fresh air. I'm not constantly checking the time, thinking about where something has to be, thinking about where my clothes are, thinking about because sometimes, to give you an idea of how jammed the schedule can be, a lot of times, and this is even more apparent in times past, because there have been times where I didn't have the luxury of having the washer and dryer be in the house, right? I had to go to a laundromat. And so I would get really upset if something happened to dirty my clothes, right? Spilled something or touched something or got next to somebody who was ill and needed to wash my clothes. Those things used to really upset me because it was not always the most convenient thing in the world, and it put a huge time constraint on the coming hours or days or whatever, right? And so it just goes to show that nobody has a 9 to 5 job. Most people have a 24-hour job when you think about how the time gets committed during the rest of the oh, I swear this whole year of 2024, I only had 3 days where I didn't go the time. And unfortunately, it really short circuits a lot of good creative thoughts, right? When I was in Kerrville, a lot of things that I didn't think of when I was back home came to my mind, right? I came home and I was able to figure things out with my work. I was able to figure things out with how to talk to various people. I uh, I negotiated the contract for the summer. I moved into another place with some good roommates. I found a good place. I didn't feel rushed to move into housing and have bad chemistry. I've done that before, right? You're in a rush to move from one place to another. You end up in a place with bad chemistry. That's why I ended in some places that didn't have washers and dryers, and you get the idea, right? And unfortunately, I only got 3 days of that this year. I need to be doing that more. But I have a few solutions for how we can tone down this clock sickness in our society. The number one thing we could do is we need to relax our working conditions, our dress codes, our policies as much as we can, as long as it's safe to do so. Right. So, for example, I can never for the life of me understand why we have etiquettes revolving around not eating at our desks at work. And as long as it's safe to do so, right? Obviously, if you work with radioactive chemicals, if you're if you're eating something that other people might have allergies to, sure, go ahead and restrict that. But short of that, I don't understand why we have a social norm of not eating at our desk. And I think that would simplify a lot of things. First of all, you have people who have eating disorders, and it, restricting times that they can eat and forcing all of their meals into to other time slots creates havoc for that. But even if you don't, right, the freedom to be able to eat whenever you want, it frees up your mental clock cycles, or you don't have to think about I got class at whatever. Oh my God, another opportunity just opened up here. Maybe you're doing gig work, right? Somebody calls you to do some other gig work at whatever time, right? And if you could eat in front of those jobs, you won't have to think about, right? We should also try to relax our dress code as much as we can, right? Now, this has to be done society wide, right? Because obviously, if one college decides to relax their dress codes and another doesn't, right, it'll create unfair competition, right? But in tandem, I wish all of society would relax all of these things at one time, right? We really should, especially the eating at the desk. You got to understand, some people have religious issues. They can only eat at a certain time. Some people have former eating disorders. Some people like to do intermittent fasting. Some people need to do intermittent fasting for various chronic health conditions. So, not allowing food at your desk can be almost a hazard in its own right, right? You got to understand that, right? I personally think that nobody should be allowed to restrict your eating. It should almost be a civil liberty, unless there's good, compelling reason to do so, right? So, for example, I personally think that if you go to a movie theater, they should not be allowed to restrict you from bringing outside food. Now, you might say, well, that's how they make their money. Well, then they need to serve food that the majority of people will want to buy, right? Does anybody need to restrict me from bringing outside food to a restaurant that I love? No, right? So personally, I think unless there's a good, compelling safety reason, right? If you're it's like instead of a movie or a concert, pretend that you went to see uh somebody demonstrate some kind of chemistry process, right? You're going to a conference where somebody has discovered moscovium. They were showing you how to isolate it from its, or it's radioactive, it might be poisonous, and yeah, certainly restrict eating at that point, right? But short of that, nobody should be allowed to restrict where, when you can eat, right? As long as it's safe to do so, right? And dress codes should be, as far as I'm concerned, I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but I think we should be allowed. I know this is it's going to sound ridiculous. I think we should be allowed to go out there naked, right? It would eliminate a lot. We wouldn't have to wash our clothes anymore, right? We wouldn't have to worry about our clothes anymore. And quite frankly, it might facilitate us in finding the right life partners, and we might have a better relationships, lower divorce rates, right? But that's another story for another time. More importantly, it would eliminate a lot of this nonsense, right? But they say that humans only use 10% of their brains. It's an urban myth. But I think it's more accurate to say we only use 10% of the time God has given us. So much of our time gets wasted with all this junk work, if you will, right? All right. So another thing we could do with our society is that we could desynchronize things a little bit. How would that work? Pretend you work for, let's say you work for McDonald's, because so many people are upset about fast food work these days. Pretend you work for McDonald's. To desynchronize work means that you would show up to work whenever time you wanted to, right? Whatever suits you best, and you might not even give a whole lot of notice on when you might show up, right? Now, wouldn't that be chaos? Not necessarily. Here's why. Do your customers ever announce when they're going to show up to McDonald's? And yet, if I pick a time on the of the day, you can probably tell me approximately how many people are going to be at the McDonald's, and you can be prepared for that, right? It might be a little bit harder these. A lot of McDonald's used to open 24 hours a day. Now they don't, so it might be a little bit harder to desynchronize, right? But that would eliminate a lot of stress of looking at the clock, right? Let's say, imagine instead of teaching at a certain time, I just have to be there at a certain window, right? I think it would simplify a lot of my schedule, right? I'd still want to do more or less the same things, but I wouldn't be going the time, It's hard to say though. Eventually, things might get too relaxed, right? And then, but these are some ideas I would throw out there, right? Simplify the policy, desynchronize a little bit. This is the Peter Dislike Show. Bum 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 bum. The Peter Dislike Show. Bum 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 bum.